You know, a lot of times we go to conferences and you're hearing from speakers that will tell you, well, you know what, we just started meeting, and they all have these fantastic origin stories that are slightly exaggerated, I find. As you find the real deal. You know, it's like my wife and I moved into this town, and it's always a glorious town that has a lot of bucks. And we started this Bible study. And then it just grew, and now we're like, 10, 15,000, and I don't have lost track. It's just, we're just, our biggest problem is our growth. And you as a pastor are thinking, yeah, great story, but how in the world do I apply this in my context? And one of the things that you'll find is like from the Wesleyan denomination, Church of God, Anderson, is the vast majority of our churches are small churches. And, as I read the Gospels, you read some big numbers, like Sermon on the Mount, but Jesus spent 99% of his time with a small number of people, relationally investing in them. And Jesus always starts kingdom work with small math, small numbers, equips people to go out and do the mission. And it's not about massive, I think sometimes if I was Christ and I was doing this thing and I had 3 years to do it, I would try to have the biggest, most gargantuan meetings I could have, because I know I got this short window and I got to cast the biggest net that I can in order to have this thing have some chance of survival after this crucifixion thing that I'm dreading. And then the Holy Spirit's got to take over. I got to give the Holy Spirit enough numbers to do something. That's how you know that humans did not write that story. That's an origin story. And that's the origin story, I think, that God wants to bless in each of our lives. We've been trying to get this guy for 3 years. Carl Maders, give it up for Carl. You guys outside. And Doug and I got a chance to have dinner with Carl and Shelley last night. And Doug can't be here today. He was going to be here. He got a COVID booster. And if I had my second one, I had the first booster, and I was out the next day. I mean, that's how COVID has affected me. I haven't gotten the virus yet, but the booster's knocked me on my butt. And so Doug is running a fever. He's so sorry he can't be here today. He's really looking forward to it. But we've been trying to get Carl we had him booked right before the pandemic for this time. 3 years ago? 3 years ago.
2
years ago.
2020. Yeah, before the 2 weeks to flatten the curve.
Yeah.
And then we thought, we're going to have to cancel because everything's shut down and nobody's doing anything. And then we said, let's shoot for 12 months out. Surely we'll be able. So we booked him, worked for Shelley, and booked him for 12 months after that. Can't do it. And so we said, we're not giving up. So we're booking him out for 12 months, which is today. So we're so glad to have him today. Carl has served in his local church for
29 years.
29 years. And focuses, it's a small church in Orange County, California. And he is devoted and passionate about equipping pastors to not just be effective in small churches, but to embrace it. To not think of yourself as like second-class citizens. That if you were only successful, you would be like, okay, we're 100 here, we're going to be 200 here, 500, we're going to be 1,000. Just get that out of your mind that that's the definition of success. Because if that's the definition of success, Jesus failed in Acts. He failed. But we know he didn't. And God loves relationally connected, small number churches. He does some of his most powerful work. I'm a product of a small church that raised up 3 or 4 pastors in a church that never grew over 75, typically more 45 to 60. So I'm taking up way more time. Welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. I've had worse introductions than that. That was a good intro. I like that. You get the concept. We know exactly where we're heading today. It is wonderful to be with you. And yes, as Jeff said, wow, this was a long time coming. This is the season of makeups. For golfers, this is a mulligan, I guess. We had to get 2 of them, but I was so grateful to be here. I just wanted to be clear. I'm not the one who canceled. It was the Rona that canceled us, right? That's what happened. I'm waiting for the Misha Rona to come along, you know. Yeah, 4 of us who are my age caught that one. Yeah. Yeah. I got 1. Okay. Now I know how to direct everything today. He's got the sense of humor over here. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. It really is an honor to be here. So I'm going to start the way I always start these talks. Hi, I'm Carl, and I'm a small church pastor. It's not that kind of meeting. So let me start, first of all, with a couple definitions because the definitions are important. Small is a relative term. So let me first begin by when I say small church, what is a small church? In my first book, The Grasshopper Myth, I defined small church one way. And then later on in my second book, 5 years later, Small Church Essentials, I defined small a different way. Today I'm going to define small yet a third and better way. And 5 years from now, I'll have an even better definition. But this is my current working definition of a small church. When I'm talking about a small church, I'm talking about 2 very distinct types of churches. First of all, there's the church of 50, give or take 50. And then there's a church of 150, give or take 50. Those are 2 very distinct types of churches, but they both count as small. I am very well aware that the church of 50, give or take, and the church of 150, give or take, are very different. So if you're in a church of 20 and you just heard 50, give or take, that includes 200, that includes small, and the screen says 300, like, does he have a clue what small means? I get it. So anything above 200, if you're above 200 to 300, you have the privilege of being welcomed into the group, but you don't really belong. You're into mid-size at that point. But here's why 50, give or take 50, and 150, give or take 50, despite the very significant differences between those sizes, why they're still called small, and it's this. Because above 200 or so in size, you have to make the biggest shift in pastoral philosophy that you have to make of all sizes. And the reason is simple, because of our capacity for both memory and availability. God knows everyone and is everywhere, but you're not him. So as pastors, as leaders, in a church of 50, you can know everybody very well and be there pretty much for every need. 150, give or take, you can still probably know pretty much everybody and be there for most things. You can do most of your pastoring hands-on. Once you get above those numbers, you've got to delegate more and more of the pastoring, and it just shifts to a completely different thing. So when we talk today, I keep both of those particular types of small churches in mind, and I want you to be aware of that. But really what I'm speaking is really more from a small church context, more that including into a small church context. So that's the answer to the first question, what is a small church? The second question I get is, well, what do you say when you're a small church pastor? What does that mean? Well, as Jeff mentioned earlier, Shelley and I have been, and there's Shelley, by the way. Say hi, Shelley. She's being my photographer now. She's my chauffeur between places, and she's all the other wonderful things in between those times. So, so I've been a small church pastor for almost 40 years now, and I didn't know I was a small church pastor until about 10 years ago. See, I thought I was a big church pastor that just hadn't arrived yet. Right? But any day now, and at the 25-year point, is like, maybe there's something permanent about this. I'm not sure. So Shelley and I have pastored 3 different churches in our ministry together. The first one was a tiny little chapel in the Redwoods on the coast of California. I'm from California. You're just going to have to love me for it anyway, because Jesus says so. I've done all my ministry in California. So our first pastorate was a little chapel in the Redwoods, the biggest trees on earth, right, on the coast of California. It was so deep into the Redwoods that if you drove into the church parking lot at noon on a sunny California day, your automatic headlights would go on. It's a little tiny chapel deep in the Redwoods. We were there for 4 years or so and had a great opportunity to do ministry there. We then went to a church in the north part of the San Francisco Bay Area and spent the 20 longest months of our ministry lives there. It was a difficult church. Difficult is being kind. And we left it, at the end of 20 months, we left there with our tail between our legs, and I wasn't sure I was called to ministry anymore. We then showed up at a little church in Southern California, Orange County, 8 miles south of Disneyland. We are actually on a main street. We were actually on one of the border streets for Disneyland, 8 miles directly to the north of us. Tiny little chapel, but it's on a big street with a lot of people going by, so I thought, oh, this place is going to be big real quick because we got a lot of people to draw from. Our main room is maybe a third smaller than this room, and we've got that and a couple other small rooms. We have even less parking than that. If you come to our church on a Sunday morning and sit in the back row, there will only be 4 rows in front of you. It's a tiny little chapel. In the decade before I got there, they'd been through 5 pastors in the previous 10 years. So when I came, I told them, you haven't been pastored for a decade. You've had a series of extended guest speakers. Especially when you take 6 to 9 months between pastors, like we're talking less than 18 months per pastor for 10 years. And so we came hurting from our situation. They were a very hurting church, which is usually a recipe for absolute disaster. But the Lord knew what he was doing, even though we didn't. So we showed up at this church. They had a dozen on a typical Sunday. If it was 30, that was a huge, huge Sunday. But again, we thought any time now it's going to really get bigger. But when we got there, we were so bruised and beaten, and the church was so bruised and beaten, that for the first 6 or 7 years, we did very little other than have Sunday morning worship services and potluck fellowships. That wasn't decision. That was just about all any of us had the energy for. And so we just did that. And then at about 7 years, at that point, we were running about 75 people, just to give you a numerical marker. So about 70. I remember very distinctly, I got in my car after a day in the office, and I sat in my car, and I was looking out the windshield of the car at the church building, and all of a sudden it hit me. That's a healthy church. I'm looking at a healthy church. Well, the building, right? My theology is intact. And then because I was looking through the windshield of the car over the hood, I thought, you know what? I feel like I've been under the hood of this church for 7 years. I finally got the thing fixed. Now I'm sitting in the driver's seat, and I don't know where to take it. What do you do with a healthy church? Like, I know how to fix bad ones, but what do you do with a healthy one? They hadn't been healthy. I hadn't pastored a healthy church in 10 years, and they hadn't been one for 20. So what do you do with a healthy church? So I actually went to our deacon board, and I told them about that, and they were as surprised as I was that the church was healthy, because they hadn't been used to it either. And then together, what do we do? And we decided, well, let's reach out to the community. Let's bring them on in. I think we got, the infection in the hospital has been cured. Let's bring some patients in, kind of a thing. So we did. We started going out to the neighborhood and reaching out in all kinds of different ways. And over the next 7 or 8 years, we grew a little bit more until we got to about 200 people or so. And that was when all the church growth conferences started calling me and saying, Carl, we want you to come and teach us how you took a church from 20 to 200 in just 15 years. Yeah, you don't get those calls. But at that point, we were overwhelming our small facility twice on a Sunday. So we were beyond the 80% capacity. So I looked around, and after a long search, I finally found a local junior high school that would, on Sunday mornings, allow us to rent their CAFA Gymnatora Librarium. You know, that multipurpose room that every junior high school in America has? Yeah, that one. And it was maybe 4 times the size of this. It was really, really big for us. So every Sunday morning, a faithful group of people tore everything down from our sanctuary, brought it over, set it up. We had service. They tore it back down, brought it over, set it back up again in our sanctuary, because everything else was running in our sanctuary during the rest of the week. And we did that for a while. In the next 2 years, we grew from 200 to 400 people as we were meeting there. So it was really explosive growth. And then at 400, I went to our deacon board and I said, we got to hire some people, because this massive growth is wearing the staff out. We are done. We are toast. There's just we've doubled the amount of people we're responsible for. And I said, I don't want to just hire a staff for 400. I want to hire a staff for a church of 600, because you can see the trajectory. And they agreed, yeah, we got to do that. So I went out. We hired a staff for the church of 600. It held on at 400 for a couple months, and then it did a turnaround nosedive. So in 2 years, we went from 200 to 400. And then in less than a year, we went from 400 down to, actually, I can't tell you how small we got, because it's fun to count when you're growing. But when you're dropping that fast, it's like, don't give me the numbers anymore. I know everybody's name. Thank you very much. It's like, I'm just trying to put out the flames. I don't need to know the temperature of the fire. But good news was we didn't need to rent the junior high school anymore. And we fit back in our chapel real nice. And I don't know the exact numbers. I really don't, because I just told them, don't tell me anymore. I don't need to know. But every Sunday we were under 100. There were some Sundays we were under 50. And there had been no scandal, and there had been no split. And I was left reeling. I didn't know what had gone on. I'd done everything they told me to do. I followed the book to the letter. And it just collapsed. And so I got frustrated, and then I got mad, because I'm a red-blooded American male. So I got mad. I got mad at the people, I got mad at the church, I got mad at myself, I got mad at God. Got mad at Rick Warren for some reason. I don't know why. Yeah, and I found myself in this place where I actually went to the church board and I said, I'm taking 40 days away. And the only reason I asked for 40 days is because I couldn't find an 80 in the Bible. I actually did. I did a search. I did a word search of the Bible, thinking somebody in the Bible had to have taken like an 80 or 100-day retreat. It's all 40s, just so you know. And I figured if it's in the Bible, they'll give it to me. That was my thought. And I said, I got to take 40 days away because that sounded spiritual. And they were like, oh, okay, I guess we can't do anything about it if you're going to leave. And I did not know if I would come back either to that church or to ministry. And during that 40 days, I found a Christian counselor in the area who used to have been a pastor, so he could speak the language. And I sat down with him at least once a week and just poured my heart out. So confession number 1 is, hi, I'm Carl, and I'm a small church pastor. Confession number 2 is, hi, I'm Carl, and I've been to therapy. And pastoring put me there. Yeah, that's part of my story. So I went there and I just poured my heart out to him, what's going on here. And at about the end of the second session, I said, I've been talking, like, do you have anything to offer? Can you help me here at all? And he looked at me and he said, Carl, it sounds to me like you need to redefine success in ministry. And when he said that, I didn't know if I wanted to walk out or punch him in the nose and then walk out. I said, so here's the deal. You're telling me that I've been trying to jump a 10-foot bar, but I can only jump 8 feet. So let's lower the bar to 8 feet, jump over that, and call it success. That's not success, that's cheating. He said, I know, that's not what I'm talking about. He said, if numbers are over here, success in ministry is over here. And then he said a sentence that changed my life. He said, you have to figure out how to define success in ministry without numbers attached to it. And that changed everything for me. You got to define success in ministry without numbers attached to it. I looked at him and said, I don't even know what that means. He said, honestly, I don't either, but we have to figure that out together, because chasing the numbers is killing you, and it sounds like it's killing a great church as well. So I'll tell you a little bit more of my story as we go on through the day to let you know what actually happened there and how we fixed it. But how did I end up in that position, in a therapist's office, just about ready to quit ministry? It was because I believe something that I have since come to call the grasshopper myth. And before I get to that, actually, let me point this out to you. For everything that I'm doing today, we're doing 6 sessions today. So I'm going to be talking a lot. So if at any point you kind of fade out and you miss 10 minutes of it because it's just too much to endure, you can go back and you can check the notes. So I've created a page just for this conference today. carlvaders.com is my website, /under300. Or you can scan the QR code that will take you to my link tree, where you can press that button and get to so that URL will always be up. That that QR code later on will change for the next conference, the next one I do. But that URL there will always be just for this room here. Yes.
I need that gentleman to move for 1 minute so I can scan the QR code.
Oh, okay. Right here, you. He comes in late. He gets in the way. There we go. That's it. You can go back now. They got it. They got the QR code. All right. All right. Here we go. All right. So there we go. So yeah, that'll get. And if you miss that now, you can pick it up at the book table later as well. There's a QR code that you can scan there as well, or just simply enter that URL into your phone. And that'll give you all the notes for today. One of the advantages of doing online notes is if you go through it, you're going to see about a third of the notes. I will have a clickable link that you can click on, and it'll go to an article that I wrote about that particular subject, so you can get more information to follow up later, so you can kind of continue to follow through and get some more information. So, as I said earlier, I went through all of that stuff, and I ended up in the therapist's office. I ended up in this place of frustration and almost leaving ministry because I believe something that I have since come to call the grasshopper myth. Anybody else need that? Otherwise, I'm going to shift to the next slide. All righty. So when you write a book called The Grasshopper Myth, that was the title of my first book, like Ricky used to say to Lucy, you got some explaining to do. So what is the grasshopper myth? And here's how I define it. It's the false impression that our small church ministry is less than what God says it is because we compare ourselves with others. Can anybody identify the toxic word in that sentence? Yeah, compare. Nobody ever guesses any other word. We all know. Right? I'm not telling anybody in the room anything new. Comparison will kill you. And that was what I did. Here I was. I'm coming to this church in Southern California. It's tiny, but it's on a big road. There are tens of thousands of people who come by us every day. And within a half an hour drive of my house is the original Calvary Chapel, the original Vineyard, Saddleback Church, Church on the Way, the Crystal Cathedral, Angelus Temple, Fuller Church Growth Institute, and Azusa Street. So I live within half an hour drive, not just where big things begin, but where big movements have started. And I'm going, me next, right? We'll just get rid of this building. We'll get a bigger one, no problem. And, 15, 20 years down the road, it hasn't happened. And I'm looking around and going, what have I done wrong here? Everybody else seems to be. And of course, it isn't everybody else. It's just a handful that are very noticeable. There's a ton more small churches around us than there are big ones. You just notice the big ones. And the comparison was what put me in that place. Now, of course, it comes from, as we know, the book of Numbers, chapter 13, where it says this, the 12 spies go into the land. And when they come back, and this is part of their report of the 10, all the people we saw there are of great size. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. One translation said there are giants in the land. And here's my question. Where did they see grasshopper first? In their own eyes. In their own eyes. If you don't see a grasshopper in your mirror, no one else will see a grasshopper in you. Eleanor Roosevelt is credited with saying that the only one who can make you feel inferior is you. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. But I gave that consent to people around me, to big churches around me, who were not trying to make me feel miserable. They were not trying to make me feel inferior. Rick Warren did not write The Purpose-Driven Church to make me feel bad. I read that into it, and I reread it later and realized it's not in there. I put it in there. That's on me, not on him. And so we see the grasshopper in our own eyes. It's also backed up in Ephesians when Paul gives his body analogy. It doesn't start with the hand despising the foot. It starts with the foot despising itself. Read it. It starts with self-despising. It doesn't start with the hand going to the foot. Well, you're only a foot. You don't matter. It starts with the foot saying, because I'm not a hand, I'm not a part of the body. It starts with self-despising every single time. And that's what I did to myself. Nobody else is responsible for that. That is on me. So I had to go on the journey of redefining success in ministry. So let's walk through some of that, shall we? And just so you know, we are doing 6 sessions today. The first one, this is going to be the longest session, the first one. And after lunch sessions, they will get shorter and shorter and shorter because our attention spans will be doing the same. I'm aware of that. I'm gonna have to keep myself awake in the after lunch stuff. I get it. They'll get shorter and more practical as the day goes along, but this is going to establish some foundational truths for us as we go on for the rest of the day. So some of the first things that I discovered were what I now call the 3 undeniable realities of church ministry. Reality number 1, 90% of churches will never be larger than 300 people. How do we know that? Because the best predictor of future events is past events, and for 2,000 years and counting, as the church has been and remains the most relentlessly growing organism in human history, 90% of churches were never larger than 300 people. In fact, you'd probably be closer to 95%. have never been larger than 300 people. How has this thing gone forward on the back of small after small after small? Well, that's part of what we'll be talking about today. So that's reality number one. 90% of churches will never be larger than 300 people. Reality number two, virtually all pastors will pastor a small church for at least some time in our ministry. Rick Warren pastored a small church for like 6 weeks. But his first Sunday was him, his wife, and their real estate agent. That counts as small, right? And so every once in a while I'll meet, younger pastors and like, oh, no, that won't be me. Well, it'll be you for at least a while, and it'll probably be you for most of your ministry, and for most of you, it will be you for all of your ministry. Most of us are going to pastor a small church for all of our ministry, and virtually all of us will pastor a small church for at least some time in our ministry. So here's my question. If we're all going to do it, shouldn't we figure out how to do it well? But almost all of the teaching for the last 40 years has been about how not to be small. And then the 90% of us or more who spend most of our ministry in small, we think, I must be blowing something because I'm somehow not learning this lesson. But when you take a look at history, you discover that virtually all pastors have pastored a small church for most, if not all, of their pastoral ministry. And somehow, Jesus figures out how to make a church grow anyway. So maybe all of these small churches aren't a problem to be fixed. Maybe they're part of a strategy that God wants to use. And that was how I had to start reframing my thought process in this. We're all going to do it. Let's figure out how to do it well. So if you're pastoring a small church, you're not less than, you're normal. And I don't fix normal. So I'm not here to help your church get bigger. Why? I wasn't able to do it, so I'm not going to come in like an expert on it. But I can tell you what it looks like to have a really healthy, vibrant, missional, outreaching small church that really does great kingdom work. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Which leads to reality number three. You can lead a small church well without settling for less. This is one of the first things I learned, because as I started to explore it, one of the things I get regularly is, well, you're fine with small, but I'm not going to settle for less. I'm not settling for less. I'm not settling for less. I've got a couple of friends who are in church growth stuff, and I've gotten to know them over the last few years, and every once in a while, they'll write an article where the implication again is, well, small is okay, but if you really want to reach the world for Jesus, follow my stuff because I'm going to help you get bigger. It's like, quit acting like we don't want to reach the world for Jesus. I don't know a small church pastor who doesn't want to reach the world for Jesus. But sometimes, and for most of it, it appears the Lord says your role in that is going to be this size, because that's where I've placed you. That's where I can use you the best. And it's got nothing to do with limiting what God can do. It's got nothing to do with settling for less. We've got to dispense with that. It's not what it's about. You can lead a small church well. You can be in the center of God's will for your life and for the church's life and for the community you're reaching, and not settle for less. So that's what we need to be looking at. What if when Jesus said, I will build my church, what he had in mind was not a world that only had grand cathedrals and big box mega churches? What if when Jesus said, I will build my church, what he had in mind was a handful of those, but a whole bunch of small way stations of faith tucked into every corner of the globe? What if that's his strategy and we've been fighting him on it? And I think we need to at least ask that question. So, how do we end up in this spot? How did I end up in the therapist's office? How do we end up looking at these things and going, I don't know, it seems like settling for less? We do this thing, and I call it IKEA envy. Don't fall for IKEA envy. It's got to be a good 15, 20 years or so ago when they put an IKEA in near our house. And one day my wife said, we got to go pick up, I don't know, a chest of drawers or something. And we're going to go to this new furniture store called IKEA. Okay, fine. So I get in the car and we're heading there, and I have no idea what I'm coming to. And I drive up to the biggest building on the face of the earth, right? And I'm telling you, astronauts can see it from space. And I'm like, wow, this is a store? Okay, okay, fine. I've been in big stores before. I've been in Bass Pro Shop. I've been in the mall. I know what's going to happen. We're going to walk in. She's going to go her way, find what she wants. I'm going to go somewhere, and I'm going to find something that doesn't bore me completely to death. And when she's ready, she'll text me. I'll meet her outside. I'll help her haul the stuff out to the car. I know how this works. Oh, no, not in an IKEA. You're not allowed to do that in an IKEA. How many of you have never been in an IKEA before? Okay, I'm now going to spare you ever having to go. After you hear my explanation, you're going to be grateful that you never have been. This is an actual floor map of an actual IKEA. And you notice the arrows and the dots? Is it reminiscent of anything like, I don't know, something where there's cheese at the end? And the fact is, at the IKEA, there is cheese at the end. It's called Swedish meatballs, but there's cheese at the end. Right? So when you go to an IKEA, no, you can't just wander around. There's a maze you have to follow to get through. In fact, take a look at it here, right? On the left, that's an actual IKEA. Look at what's on the floor. There's actual arrows on the floor. Otherwise, you get lost. You can't get there. Now, here's what I want you to imagine. I want you to imagine that the chairman of Starbucks gets together with their top executives and says, okay, we're putting together a 5-year plan for the growth of Starbucks, and here's what we've done. We've gone around the world and we've measured all the IKEAs, and the average IKEA has 250,000 square feet. We've gone around and we've measured all of the Starbucks, and the average Starbucks has 800 square feet. We have to fix this if we're going to compete with IKEA. Does that make any sense on any measure whatsoever? No. Because Starbucks and IKEA, while they're both in business, they are in very, very, very different businesses. Very big and in a handful of places works really well for IKEA. Really small and everywhere works well for Starbucks. And nobody can argue that their business plans haven't worked. Big and in a few spots has worked extraordinarily well for IKEA. Small and everywhere has worked extraordinarily well for Starbucks. Right? But here's what happens. Most of us serve in Starbucks-sized churches, and we're trying to do it by the IKEA plan because we have IKEA envy. Some of it is because we come to conferences like this, and most of the time the pastor who's speaking is the pastor of the biggest church in the area, and they are in an IKEA-sized church. And so they give you IKEA principles, and they're not wrong. They fit in an IKEA-sized church. Because when you're pastoring a church of hundreds or thousands of people, you need arrows on the floor precision, or the whole thing falls to pieces. But I've never walked into a Starbucks and gone, where's the arrow? I don't know where to go. It's real obvious in a Starbucks because of the size. Starbucks has a part of their, IKEA has the arrows because they want to get you through, and at the end, you have to go through all of it to get, like a tasty morsel of something maybe at the end, right? It's designed that way, to get you through. Starbucks, you walk in, and nobody's trying to get them through. Think years ago, the old original like diners and fast food joints, they all had the same color schemes. It was all oranges and reds and yellows, right? Burger King, McDonald's, Denny's, go through the list, right? You know why? Because they've done studies and they've discovered orange, red, and yellow catches your eye to bring you in, but after you've been there for not too long, it drives you crazy and you have to leave. It's designed to get you in and get you out quickly. Starbucks goes greens, browns, earth tones. Why? Because they're not rushing you out. If you ever walked into a Starbucks and seen a bunch of college students in the corners cramming for finals with their laptops open, Starbucks isn't rushing them out. They gave them plugins and Wi-Fi. They want them to linger. They want them to stay. In fact, whenever I meet with somebody and it's like, hey, you want to meet somewhere? I don't know, let's meet at the Starbucks between us. Which one? Like, pick one of the 100 that's between us, right? Especially where I live, they're everywhere. Right? And that it's intentional. Starbucks has designed it. When I go to Starbucks, half the time it's for the coffee. The other half the time, coffee is just rent for the chair. That's really all it is, right? So they've created that. So in our smaller churches, we're hearing about IKEA precision. You've got to start right on time for this. You've got to have this. You've got to have this lined up. You've got to have that lined up. And they're not wrong. They're correct within their context. But we're in Starbucks-sized churches, we can slow down a little bit. We can relax. We can create ways for people to linger and hang out. This is a place where you can relax, where you can slow down, where it's not going to be exactly the same every week. And the precision, we're going to do things well. We're going to do things excellently. But excellence is going to look different, which we'll talk about in the second session, how excellence looks different in a small church than it does in a big church. So we're in Starbucks-sized churches. Let's understand that Starbucks has a different model for how success looks than IKEA has a model for how success looks. Neither one of them is wrong. I am not anti-big church in any way at all. I simply think we need to add small church resources to the toolbox. Because too often we're only using one tool in the toolbox, and it's the megachurch tool. It's a great tool, but I want to use other stuff as well. So Don't fall for IKEA envy. And then I learned three things. Let's walk through this for a bit. And what I discovered was that small is not a problem, a virtue, or an excuse. Let's walk through those three important words, shall we? First of all, small is not a problem. Unfortunately, it's been treated that way, sometimes by implication. Like I said, I put that on other people who weren't putting it on me. But every once in a while, it's just really blunt and rude, quite frankly. Like when I was going through this season a few years ago, and I was trying to figure out, why isn't the church growing? What is going on here? You know, I went where you got to go for answers like that. I Googled it. I Googled, why isn't my church growing? The first article that came up was an article entitled, 8 Reasons Some Churches Don't Grow, by a pastor of a very well-known and growing church whose name I will not give you, and you'll understand why in a moment. And the 8 reasons some churches don't grow in this article were this. I'll give you the exact date. The vision is not clear. The focus is on trying to please everyone. Passionless leadership. Manufacturing energy. Lack of prayer. Unwillingness to take risks. Disobedience to scriptures, and selfish attitudes. And I read through that list and I went, I must be committing one of those sins. Because my church isn't growing, and this expert on church growth, whose church is growing like crazy every single year, tells me these are but I don't feel like we're manufacturing energy. I didn't think I was trying to please everyone. I'm praying as much as I can. I don't feel passionless. I don't feel selfish. I didn't think I was disobedient to scriptures. What's going on here? Here's the deal. If you heard that list and it doesn't sound like you, then just read something else. There's a reason you can swipe it away on your just do it. And in fact, here's the deal. I'm convinced that this does not apply to any of you in the room or to the ministries that you represent. You know why? Because you showed up today. Passionless leaders don't show up. Prayerless leaders don't show up. Selfish leaders don't show up. And it makes me wonder, who does he think is up at 2 a.m. Googling, please help my church grow? It's not the disobedient pastor. It's not the selfish pastor. It's not the passionless pastor. It's the hurting pastor. And when a hurting pastor comes to you and says, my church isn't growing, don't slap their hands, put tools in them. So we've got to let some of that go by. There's some stuff I just don't read anymore because it just gets my blood boiling. It doesn't get me all upset anymore like it used to, like frustrated, like what's wrong with me. Now it gets me upset like what's wrong with you, dude. Right? So I just got to stay away from all of that. Small is not a problem. Secondly, small is not a virtue. Big churches are great. Small is not better than big. I've had it up to here with the small church pastor who says, you know, the only reason our church is small because we're the only church in town preaching the true gospel. Oh, Lord help me. Here's the deal. If you think, unless your church is the only church in your town, at which point you really don't need to say the sentence at all. If that's your attitude, then let's sit down and have a talk about your pride problem before you get up and preach on Sunday, because your pride's a bigger problem than the size of your congregation. This is ridiculous. The idea that somehow small is better than big. The big ones are all compromising. They're all watering down the gospel. Nonsense. 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 Are some big churches compromising and watering down the gospel? Yeah. I've seen some small churches do that too. It's got nothing to do with size. Nothing. Small is not a virtue. Small is not better than big. And thirdly, small is not an excuse. There is nothing that Jesus asks the church to do in the New Testament that cannot be done by 2 or 3 people who love Jesus, who want to reach their community, and who get together on an occasional basis to worship him, ideally at least weekly. This idea that somehow, well, I can't do this because, well, when we get more people, then we'll. When we get more money in the budget, then we'll. When I get a little more education, then I'll. Well, when we get this sorted out, once we get the culture back on a godly track again, well then, because it's just too hard against such an ungodly culture. I'm done with the excuses. I'm done with them from me, and I'm done with them from everybody else. I get when you're in a small place and it's frustrating. I hear the heartbeat of people who are just, so I'm not talking about genuine frustration and genuine pain when you've been pushing and pushing and pushing and that boulder just doesn't seem to go up the hill. I get that with every fiber of my being. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about an expression of genuine frustration, but I am talking about excuse making. No excuses. This has to be a no excuse zone. There's nothing in the New Testament church that Jesus gave to the church or that Paul gave to the church or anybody gave to the church that can't be done by small groups of people. Jesus knows exactly how many people you have in your church. He knows exactly what building you have or don't have. He knows exactly your budget, and he's not worried by it. Jesus did not wake up this morning worried about the size of your church. You may have, but he did not. Now, for all my theologically precise friends, Jesus has not had to wake up in the morning since he ascended into heaven 2,000 years ago. It's a figure of speech. Let's move along. As you can tell, I've had to deal with that before. Oh, my goodness. Okay, so small is not an excuse. Well, as I was going through this season that I was talking about earlier, so I find myself 40 days away from the church, going to the therapist's office, trying to figure out what's wrong with me, with ministry, has God let me down, all those questions. And I wish I could tell you that during those 40 days, I went home and I prayed and I fasted, but I try not to lie. So what I did was I went home and I watched too much TV and ate too much ice cream. That was pretty much it for 40 days. Now, please do not say, hey, Carl Vader says that when you're in a bad way, go home and, no, that is not advice. That is closer to a confession of sin, okay? And during that season when I'm just sitting there mindlessly, when you're gonna watch stupid TV, there's nothing more stupid than reality TV. So I watched a lot of reality TV, and I know reality TV isn't real. I live where they make them. And I'm married to a real housewife of Orange County. And I haven't seen any of that show, but all I can tell you is that show is not what it is. That's not the deal. So I'm watching these shows, all of these, these reality series. And the two shows that I really liked were these restaurant makeover shows. And both of them, it's always a British guy trying to tell Americans how to fix their restaurants. What is it that we Americans have about, we love the British accent? It's like, he just called you a donkey. Yeah, but he said it in a British accent. It sounded kind of cool, right? What? It's like, didn't we as a country fight an entire war so we didn't have to listen to people with British accents? Wasn't that a whole long time ago? We won it, right? So we don't have to pay attention to people with British accents, but we love it. So there's these two restaurant makeover shows, right? Two different British guys, and they're legitimate restaurant people. Again, it's reality TV, so it's not real. I get it. But they'd go into a restaurant, and as I'm watching this just over and over again, mind-numbingly, I started noticing a pattern. And the pattern was, several times they'd come in and they'd go, I drove by this place 3 times because I couldn't see your sign. Or they'd walk in and they'd go, whoa, what is that smell? When was the last time this carpet was cleaned, right? Or they'll walk in and they'll see a 20-page menu with 400 items on it and go, oh, no. We're trimming this down to 1 page of one type of food served 5 different ways, and you're going to be the only place in the community that does this. There's a whole bunch of church stuff in there, right? We'll get in some of the simplifying stuff later. But here's one thing they never did. Not one of these expert restaurateurs ever walked into a failing restaurant, looked around and said, you know what this restaurant's problem is? It's too small. Not once. In fact, sometimes they had too much floor space and they'd block a whole bunch of it off, or they'd have the too big a menu and they'd say, this menu in that kitchen makes no sense, we're trimming that down. One of the first things they always did was trim stuff back. Sometimes you're trying to stay open 24/7 and you got one cook, No, we're going to trim it back. You're going to be just a dinner hour restaurant. You're only going to serve this. We're going to block off all of that. You're only going to have 4 tables. You're going to be premium. You're going to be great. You're going to welcome the community. We're going to clean it up. We're going to simplify it. And why did they do that? They did that because they had figured out something that we in the church need to figure out. Bigger fixes nothing. Bigger fixes nothing. Sometimes you'll ask a pastor, what's your plan for the church? Well, our plan is to get to 300. That's not a plan. That's just getting bigger. How you might get there, there might be a plan involved in that, but getting to that number, that's not a plan. Bigger fixes nothing. Think about it. If you got an unhealthy small church and all you do is make it bigger, you now have an unhealthy big church, and that's not better, that's worse. Right? But if you take an unhealthy small church and you get it to healthy, even if it doesn't become bigger, healthy is better. Bigger fixes nothing. Healthy is always better. And please understand, I'm not talking about healthy as a means to bigger. That's almost how it's always expressed to us. And that was part of what got me to the point of frustration and in the therapist's office was I looked around and went, I thought we were getting better, but apparently we're not because we're not getting bigger. And because everybody said, right, what's the phrase? All healthy things grow. Well, here's a better way to phrase it. All healthy things grow till their optimum size. Like my feet grew until they stopped growing, but there's nothing wrong with my feet. They're fine. Back in the day, before I wrote my first book, I actually put this story in my first book. There's a little girl in the church named Lauren, and she's not little anymore. She just got married 2 months ago, so shows you how old I am. And Lauren, her mom came to me one Sunday just laughing. She said, Lauren said the cutest thing about you this week. I said, what? She said, she was asking why Grandma is shorter than me if Grandma's older than me. Because in her little brain, when you're older, you're bigger. And she was trying to explain it. She couldn't figure it out. And all of a sudden, she gasped. And she said, oh, Pastor Carl must be the oldest person in the world. Because I'm the tallest person she'd ever met. So she was convinced that older meant bigger. And we've got this thing that healthier means bigger. And it doesn't necessarily correspond. Some churches, when they get healthier, get bigger. Most churches, when they get healthy, get somewhat bigger. But most churches are going to get to an optimum size. Grapes will never become the size of pumpkins. Roses will never become the size of redwoods. Doesn't matter how much you water them or feed them or teach them redwood growth principles. It's not in their nature. So what do? You have one big pumpkin and you'll have a whole bunch of grapes. You have one big redwood and you have tons of roses. That's the way the multiplication happens. And that's the way it happens in the church as well. Bigger fixes nothing. Now I understand that with bigger things come certain opportunities, but it also comes with challenges as well. Right? There's so many small church pastors who are looking around going, you know what? Oh, if only my church would get bigger, then all my problems would be solved. If only I had more people, all these problems would go away. More people equals fewer problems? Have you met people? There's been no place, no time, anywhere on earth where more people have equaled fewer problems. Different problems, but never fewer. That's not how the math works. Bigger fixes nothing. So, how do we start recalibrating and rethinking? I discovered a principle a little while ago, and they called it the long tail. So let me show you here. This is how Amazon works. This is how YouTube works. This is how Google works and all of them. Let's take YouTube for an example. On YouTube right now, there are millions and millions and millions of videos. And there are a handful of, everybody wants the viral video, right? Everybody wants to be up here, right? Popular. We want the viral video. But here's the deal. There's only a handful of, billion view videos. There's only a handful of them. They get all the attention. They get a lot of notice, but there's only a handful of them. So we've got popularity here, how many views you've got, and how many a product. So over here you've got, one best-selling video of all time right now. You've got 10 maybe I don't know how many in the several billion club, right? And then you've got more than that in the several million club, and then you've got more than that in the several 100,000 club. And you get all the way down here, and you've got millions and millions and millions and millions of videos with 10 or fewer views, right? I remember when YouTube first came out, and I realized I can put up high quality video on this thing for free, and anybody in the world can watch it high quality for free. How are they doing that? What's going on? Well, because they've embraced what they call the long tail. What Amazon and YouTube and all of these companies know, again, we'll stick with YouTube now, is that there are as many views in the big spike as there are total views in the long tail. There are as many people watching the millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of small view videos as there are people viewing the very few multi-million hit videos. As many eyes here as there are here. So, let's replace the words with these words. In the church, it's exactly the same thing. In the church, you've got a number of people, you've got a handful of really super ridiculously high growth churches. The big churches are in the big spike. But you've got millions of small churches, and you go all the way down here to churches of less than even a dozen people, and you've got even more of those than you've got this. The church of 20 is a far more common expression of the body of Christ even than a church of 200 is. Far more common. The smaller you get, the more churches there are. And some of this is guesstimate because we don't really know about China and a lot of other places like that, but we know like the church is growing like crazy in some of these oppressive places. The numbers are probably way bigger than even our craziest estimates because we just don't know, but we know they're there and we know they're multiplying at an unbelievable rate. So if you take a look at that and you realize, right now, according to the Pew Forum, which is one of the most reputable polling firms about religion and ethics in the world, according to the Pew Forum, there are about 2 billion people on earth who call themselves Christian to the point where they go to church regularly, about 2 billion people. And if you were to line up that 2 billion people in a row, from those who attend small churches on this side to those who attend large churches on this side, the middle line is about 250. So you've got 1 billion people on earth attending churches under 250 and 1 billion people attending churches over 250. So 1 billion people in the big spike, 1 billion people going to churches in the long tail. 90% of churches are in the long tail. Half of the people are in the long tail, right? So that's how that works. So you take a look at that and you go, okay, so which part of the body of Christ can we just toss out and do without? YouTube's figured out that the small one's of value. The church should have figured it out before YouTube did. Right? They know that each needs the other. If they stopped all of this from showing up, nobody would be going on board to watch the latest Justin Bieber video. And if they didn't have Justin Bieber, people wouldn't know about it in order to go and see what grandma's putting up over here. Right? Each needs the other. They understand that in the business world. They figured it out. It's an absolute business principle. They call it the long tail, and it works particularly in the online world, but it works in the church. This is exactly what it looks like in the church. So for those of us who are ministering in small churches, we may be way over here on the end and think there's only the few of us, but take a look at what you're a part of. First of all, we're a part of half the body of Christ in small churches. And then what would happen if this started half of the church and this half of the church would actually start cooperating on more stuff and helping each other and appreciating each other and sharing resources and sharing ideas? It's beginning to happen. It's beginning to happen. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, the Lord has really helped us in the last few years to do some of this. In the message that I've got going out there. So Compassion International, for instance, has reached out to me, and they're actually bringing in a bunch of small church people to their headquarters in Colorado Springs in August, because they want to hear from us about how to do missions better in small churches. They want to hear from that. They recognize the value of the long tail. Purpose Driven at Saddleback reached out to us a couple years ago, and in August I'm actually going to be speaking twice at what will be Rick Warren's last Purpose Driven conference in August, because this is his last year in ministry there. And some of it is because they're looking at that transition and they're looking out ahead and they're going, in the handoff, we need to do small better than we've done it. And that's not me saying that about them. That's their statement to me. We don't do small as well as we should. Can you help us do small? And the big spike is reaching out to the folks in the long tail and saying, we've got to do this better. So that's beginning to happen in some really, really wonderful ways. So if you ever think about me again after today, I ask you to pray for us as we try to negotiate this. The last thing I want to do is for us, as we talk about small churches, to create this separate piece over here where we're having a conversation and further distancing ourselves from our brothers and sisters in large congregations. If I am in any way responsible for any of that, I will have failed. That is not at all. I want to build those bridges, and I think the resources of the big combined with the boots on the ground of the small, what a powerful thing that God wants us to do. And that's beginning to happen. The Lord is beginning to allow those things to take place. And for some reason, it's put me in a position where I'm participating in that process. So again, if you ever think about me, not that you ever need to, but if you ever do, and you'll wonder what could I pray for him about, that is what you can be praying with me about, because I'm stepping into an area where I'm learning it as I go and trying to figure out even how to communicate back and forth with folks like this. But so far, that's what the Lord is helping us to do. Let's take a look before we take a short break at where we're going to be heading for the rest of our day together. In our next session, we're going to call it Big Churches, Small Churches, What's the Difference? And it even has this wonderful little section that I like to call, Why is my church so weird? And you notice the question isn't, is my church so weird? It's why is it? Like, your church is weird. I know. I don't need to be in it. Your church is weird. And here's the rule. The smaller the church is, the weirder it is. We're going to talk about why that is and how to actually capitalize on it rather than trying to tamp it down. But what we're going to do in the next session is this. We're going to take this Venn diagram. We're going to put it up there, and we're going to walk through it. And on the left is the big churches. On the right is the small churches. And you'll notice there is an overlap. There are things that all churches have in common, big and small. But this is an idea I came up with a couple years ago, because every time I would read a book about size differences in churches, if they ever had an illustration, the illustration was always either stair steps or a ladder. So it was, church of 50, 200, 500, 1,000, 2,000, right? And when you see stair steps or a ladder with small numbers on the bottom and big numbers on the top, what does it tell you about the value of the small compared to the value of the big, right? Even if their intention is not to give you a value judgment, that is what happens visually when you see that picture, because a ladder is meant to climb after all, right? So I wanted to come up with a visual illustration that showed you the difference between big and small without it casting a value judgment, and the Venn diagram does that. So what we're going to talk about in the next session is this overlap. So on the left, you've got the big churches here, and on the right, you've got the small churches. And the bigger your church is, the more you're going to have overlap, the more you'll have in common with other big churches, and the more you can learn from them. The smaller your church is, the less overlap you have with our big church friends, and the less help they can be to you. So if you're in a small church and you go to big church conferences, listen to big church podcasts, read big church leadership books, and you go, I can't seem to apply it to, is something wrong with me? No, that's almost certainly not what the problem is. The problem is the IKEA Starbucks comparison, right? The problem is almost certainly they're doing it in a different context. They are correct within their circle. But the smaller your church is, the less overlap they have. But here's what we're going to do in the next session. We're going to walk through why those differences exist, what they actually look like, so that you can then have a filter, so that after this point, you can go back to a big church leadership book. You can go to a big church leadership conference, and you'll have a filter that will help you understand what applies in my context and what doesn't apply in my context. See, when I was coming up in ministry, they didn't even tell me that there was a difference between the way big and small operated. And if they had told me that, they wouldn't have told me how to filter it out. So I would go to a big church conference, or I'd read a book, and I'd come back to the church. I'd try all the stuff, and it was like, oh, not again. They started dreading, oh, what conference did you go to now, Pastor Carl? What book did you read now? Like, oh. And it wasn't that they were unwilling. They were just exhausted from all the stuff that they were trying, and it didn't work. And I didn't know. I was trying stuff that's only in the green and had no overlap with my circle at all. But there is some stuff they said that did have overlap. So let's use the stuff in the overlap. But we have to figure out how to filter that. So in the next session, we'll talk about some of that so we can understand the difference so that we can filter it and get even more out of that. So that'll be our next session. And then session right before lunch, we're going to talk about preparing for post-pandemic, what's working in churches that are thriving. Because of the position that I'm in, ministering to small churches a lot, I had an opportunity throughout pandemic, especially in the first few months of it, to hear from an awful lot of churches. And I discovered there are some churches that are not just surviving through pandemic, they in fact are thriving. Even as the church building is empty on a Sunday morning, as it was for some of them for months, the amount of ministry they're doing is absolutely exploding. And it's amazing what they're doing. And others who struggled, some who closed within weeks because they already had a second or third mortgage and they couldn't go 2 weeks without an offering. And what were the differences between those that have struggled or closed and are still struggling, those that have thrived and are actually coming out of it stronger than ever? There are a handful of key differences that we can learn from. I know it can't help you with what happened, but we can anticipate what might be coming with that. So that's what we'll be looking at just before lunch. And then after lunch, here's what we'll be looking at. First session after lunch, helping your congregation heal from emotional and spiritual trauma. It's been a rough couple of years. Nobody is immune. And I've actually got a friend who is a pastor's wife and has a doctorate in education with an emphasis in neurobiology. And she's in that interesting small church world and neurobiology world. And she helped me understand a few things, plus some other research about what actually happens to our brains through seasons like what we've gone through, and how do we help others heal, our congregations heal through all of that. Some really fascinating and practical stuff in that. And then second one after lunch is going to be the next decade, a scouting report from boots on the ground pastors. We're going to take a look at some things that might be coming. Actually, it's 4 pieces. We're going to take a look at what is coming, what might be coming, what probably isn't coming, and what we can do about it. And it's really, it's not from me, it's from the pastors that I'm talking to, mostly in smaller places, but a couple from larger places as well. What can we anticipate looking forward? And then the final one after lunch is going to be, how do we discover and use what your church does well? Your church does something well, or it can do something well. And the smaller your church is, the more singular that needs to be, the more simplified that needs to be. So if you do something well or you can, how do you figure out what is our church called to do? How do we narrow it down to that? How do we lop off ministries that are no longer producing fruit, but that people still are attached to? Because that's, in a big church, no big deal. We just stop doing that. But in a small church, you stop doing something that's been done for a decade or two, even though it isn't producing any fruit. Oh boy, God bless you as you try that. So we're going to talk about some of that as well, okay? So that's what we're looking at in the next one coming up. What else? Oh yeah, I have a podcast. So if any of you is interested in podcasts, I have a podcast called Can This Work in a Small Church? And it does exactly what it sounds like. I interview people from the church leadership world, and we talk about some basic things, and then we ask, does this have to be adapted in particular ways so that it works better in a small church? It's on all podcast platforms. You can find it anywhere that you want. And the books, Shelley has those just outside the door there. You can pick up any of those today. We can talk about what each of those are if you're interested in any of those. And then, okay, here's my last piece before we have a stand and stretch break. Pastoring a small church is not a penalty for doing something wrong. Some of you in this room have come very discouraged today. I know, because I was in your shoes a lot of times. I get that. So this is what I had to learn. I mean, I've already talked about it, right? I'm sitting looking at all the big churches around me. I've done it. I've followed the book. I've done everything I'm supposed to do. What am I doing wrong? Pastoring a small church is not a penalty for doing something wrong. So what is it? It's a specialty. And it's worth doing well. I've talked to big church pastors who have told me sincerely, I could not do what you do. It would drive me out of my mind. They're not built for it. They're not built for a small church environment with the hours of conversation you've got to have, with all the meetings you've got to put together, with the persuasion you've got to do, with, they want to do things on a scale where you're looking at percentages and not visiting actual people, right? And I'm not putting them down for that. Some people are just numbers folks, and others are more people oriented. Just different ways that God wired us, and we need everybody in the kingdom. So if you're in a small congregation, it's not a penalty. It's a specialty. And so what we're going to talk about today is how do we do that specialty well? And this is different than what we usually hear, because like what I heard for years, it was never, when you're talking small churches, it was always about what you must be doing wrong and how you fix that so that you can get big. That was the mantra I heard in every church leadership thing for decades, literal decades. That was what every single one of them was saying. That is not what we're saying today. Small is designed by God for multiplication. It is designed by God for discipleship. It is designed by God for relationship and fellowship. It is designed by God to do those things just like, and the big churches do them as well, but to do them in a way that is uniquely ours and that uniquely suits at least half the body of Christ. So let's look at the tools to help us do that well. So that's what we'll be doing for the rest of the day.